Today we are talking about magical penetration items. And what we're specifically talking about is combining them. I've made a video about Obsidian Shard in the past, I've talked about Spear of the Magus in the same video as well, and I've hinted things regarding Demonic Grip here and there. But something that a lot of people are wondering about quite often is how do they work together, or is it worth picking any of them up together ever? Are they just terrible? And there's a lot of myth floating around in that regard as well, and I want to clear that up a little bit today. So first of all, we need to understand the interactions between different kinds of penetration or protection reduction. Flairboot wrote a long article about this in his Word of SLOTH, explaining that quite well, so I will just quickly summarize it here for the context of this video. You have four kinds of sorts of penetration. The first one is percentage protection reduction, which is applied first, and the other ones are in order after that. The second one is flat protection reduction. Then you have percentage penetration, and then flat penetration. And this goes for physical penetration as well, by the way. So if there was an item that would reduce the enemy protection by 50%, then everything else after that would kind of work normally, because for flat values it doesn't make any difference. So if an enemy had 100 protections, they would have 50 protections afterwards, and any flat penetration would further reduce that by the value of the flat penetration or by the value of the flat protection reduction. But if you had a percentage penetration item on top of that, that it did 50% too, it would not be very effective, because at that point it would only give you half of what is already taken down. So instead of giving you half of 100, so 50, it would only give you half of 50, meaning 25 protection, which could still be good because that item would still be incredibly strong overall, but it's just not as effective as it could be. So essentially, due to the order of penetration, percentage protection reduction, flat protection reduction, and flat penetration can always be combined without having any bad interactions. You can just use any of those items together and they will function the same all the time, with the first one being applied always being the percentage protection reduction. But when you put percentage penetration in the mix, then you lose efficiency for the percentage penetration the moment that you already have flat or percentage protection reduction. And mages happen to have access to all of those kinds of penetration. Demonic Grip comes with percentage protection reduction, Spear of the Magus comes with flat protection reduction, and Obsidian Shard comes with percentage penetration, and various items have flat penetration. So as such, it seems to not be the most effective choice to combine either Demonic Grip or Spear of the Magus with Obsidian Shard, while they can both be combined with each other quite easily, as there's no negative downside to it. But does that mean they should never be combined? That's what we're going to look into today. On that note, obviously, if Demonic Grip was a more effective item for most mages, it would change things in this context, but as it stands, most mages don't have enough attack speed and don't get enough benefit out of Demonic Grip itself to really pick up that item, so the choice is often between Spear of the Magus and Obsidian Shard. Now, for Obsidian Shard, we need to understand how the item works first. Under 40 protections, the item will always do 15% penetration. If the enemy is anywhere between 40 and 200 protection, then we have to calculate the penetration value because it scales up linear. And above 200 protection, the penetration will always be 45%. So looking at this list, you can see with the rounded values here that when the enemy has 60 protections, you have roughly 19% penetration. At 100 protections, it's 26%. At 160, it's 38%, and so on. This value then also has to be translated into a flat penetration value. So you have to take this percentage value from Obsidian Shard and factor that against the amount of protection. So you can see when the enemy has 40 protections, it is roughly 6 flat penetration, whereas at 120 protections it's 36 flat penetration, and at 200 it's 90 flat penetration. Now before we get into the next part, something important to note here. This is not all. Just the equations, the numbers that we're looking at, is not all that we need to consider in the context of Spear of the Magus and Obsidian Shard. Just be aware of that, we'll get into that later, but just don't jump to conclusions just from that. So what we also need to know, obviously, is how much penetration we get from Spear of the Magus. That is quite simple because it just depends on the stacks. You always have the 15 flat penetration, but as those get calculated last, it doesn't really matter for our results here because those won't impact Obsidian Shard. The protection reduction, on the other hand, will. And that's 10 with 1 stack, 20 with 2 stacks, 30 with 3 stacks, 40 with 4 stacks, and 50 with 5 stacks. Very, very simple. Now let's see what that turns into against targets with different levels of protection. We're going through this in steps of 20 to keep a bit of a better overview. And the first thing we're going to do is take away the protection from Spear of the Magus with 5 stacks. There's obviously not the amount of stacks we'll have most of the time. This is just to show us how Obsidian Shard would perform in a worst case scenario for the item where Magus is fully stacked. In this case, obviously if the target has below 50 protections, they have negative protections, they have none, and then they slowly get up from 10 protections to up to 250 protections when the target has 300 protections. What we need to do next is find out the percentage penetration value that Obsidian Shard has now, because that depends on the target's current protections, not the base protections. So this is also something that is impacted here directly, and the percentage goes lower as well, not just the value that's calculated anyways. So we start by having no percentage penetration at all, as the target doesn't have any protections, but once the target has 10 protections after 60 protections beforehand, you will have 15% penetration. At 100 protections, the target hits 50 protections after Magus, and Obsidian Shard starts scaling up. You can see the marked area here. That's where Obsidian Shard is scaling up gradually until at 260 protections, now 210, it hits its maximum of 45% penetration. But the important part here is what this penetration translates over into in terms of flat penetration. And here you can see on the early levels, on the early stages in terms of protections, it really doesn't do much. When the target has 100 protections, then Obsidian Shard still only has 8.4 flat penetration if you translate it over. That is not a lot. So against squishies, this combination of items basically offers nothing. But if we go a little bit further down the line, around 140 protections, we get to 21 flat penetration out of Obsidian Shard, or 22 almost. And then at 180 protections, we're already at 41.4 flat penetration out of Obsi. And I think that is the crucial point here, because that's the area where you really are going to feel a damage difference. Because yes, you can kind of compensate for penetration with higher power items, but penetration will still effectively give you more damage output with your base damage and is also usually cheaper. No item outside of the ones we're talking about here can reach more than 41 flat penetration at all, nor even close. They usually stop around 20 maximum at best. And as such, this is definitely a point we can still get value out of the item. It will require the enemy to have at least 2 magical defense items to really hit this spot. So I guess, for example, if you had a Pestilence and a fully stacked Height of the Urchin, that's roughly where this would function, depending on what guard you are, what auras are active, and other stuff. The resulting protections is also something we can look at, even though it's not that important here. You can kind of see that until around roughly 100 protections, they almost don't matter, and then they start slowly scaling up. Whereas at 300 protections, the target would have 122.5 protections. But it's not always the case that Spear of the Magus is fully stacked. What if we only have 3 stacks instead, which is not completely unlikely at all? The shift here is something we can absolutely notice in terms of how much protections we have afterwards now. We essentially have the same picture here, but it's shifted up by 20 protections as the protection reduction is 20 lower. So in this case, the effectiveness is reached around 160 protections on the enemy instead of 180. And that I think is interesting because a lot of these areas can quite easily be reached. For example, 130 protections, where Obsidian Shard is definitely not bad anymore, can be reached with Pestilence and a tankier warrior level 20 alone. With Hardwood Amulet or Arnigard and Spirit Robe, you can already get up to 140 protections, which a lot of supports will build. And then again, if you build Pestilence and Height of the Urchin and it's not even stacked, you already have 160 magic protections. It only really takes one counter item and another mixed defense item to reach those areas. So Obsidian Shard can definitely reach effectiveness relatively early, and again, it's also very cheap at the same time. Now here's some food for thought. Depending on who you're building Spear of the Magus on, even if it's effective on that guard, you won't always have your early stacks for your highest damage. Sometimes it's just not possible. Like Agni is a guard that can make use of Spear of the Magus, but sometimes you will just drop your bombs very early and just don't have the full penetration. In those moments, Obsidian Shard makes a massive difference against any tank and possibly even squishies because it's active right away and kind of bridges the gap until you're building more Spear of the Magus stacks. And as we can see, depending on how much protection the enemy team has, it can still be effective later on anyways. Likewise, Spear of the Magus is an item that you will often build against squishies. And against squishies, it is excellent in what it does, with up to basically 65 protection being completely ignored. But especially as a mage, you simply don't always have the chance to just focus down the squishies like, for example, an assassin does. As such, I will say this. Obviously, Obsidian Shard is not always the best option when you already have Spear of the Magus. Sometimes you need other items that simply work better against the enemy team. Sometimes the enemy team only has one tank, as it for example was the case in my game, so it wasn't really worth it. Sometimes other things need to be used to counter enemies, like Divine Ruin, and then it's harder to fit in. But sometimes the enemy team also has 2 frontliners and maybe a bruiser-ish play jungler, and this item can be very effective, even in combination with Spear of the Magus. So I hope this helps you a little bit with your item decisions when it comes to penetration. And with that, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope this was interesting and insightful. If you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button with the bell, it really helps me out. And other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow, probably 2 videos. DukeSloth, out.